Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in sophomore English. We turn now in our unit number 4 poetics unit to the very final 3 texts that we're going to look at. We're going to do, as your textbook likes to do, we're going to do this comparing literary works. And we're going to compare them on the perspective of theme. We're going to begin with Billy Joel's speech that he gave. It was a commencement speech. Billy Joel, a famous musician, hold fast your dreams and trust your mistakes, on page 760. But before we get there, I want to start with you on 758 and comparing theme. Of course, let's put it in our notes at 2b. The theme is an essential idea that the author of a literary work conveys. Paying attention to an author's diction, choice of words, can help a reader grasp the main message that an author wants to convey. Authors use diction, among other aspects of style, to guide readers to their theme. Some authors present a theme by dramatizing the contradictions, the conflicts, complications of life, including the following. Notice 2 bullet points here. By having hopes and making plans, people make their lives meaningful. Yet if their plans fail, their lives may seem empty. Or people strive for what they desire, yet they may long most intensely for what they have lost or can never have. By presenting such contradictions or conflicts, writers remind us that life is not just what happens to us. It also is the desires, the fears, the joys that define us, even in the face of failure. Each of the authors in this group asks whether our actions add up to something, whether we should strive for success or find peace in ourselves. Though the general topic is the same, each writer's theme or insight into the topic is different. In addition, a writer may develop his or her theme in different ways. For example, the writer may use slang, formal language, another specific choice of words to emphasize his or her particular theme. As we read through these 3 offerings, we want to use the chart there on page 758 to help us. Let's begin with Billy Joel, shall we? Notice, born in 1949, he grew up in Long Island, in the suburbs of New York City. He studied classical music as a child, but it was a performance by the Beatles that convinced him to become a professional musician. One of the most successful artists of his generation, Joel has sold more than 100 million records worldwide. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame back in 1999. Now, this is significant, so write this down. We're not looking at a poem here. We're looking at a speech, more particularly a commencement speech at Fairfield University in Fairfield, Connecticut, May the 19th, 1991. The topic here is hold fast your dreams. In this speech, Joel is going to share some life experiences and his thoughts about what it means to become an adult, and by extension, of course, a musician. For those of you who are interested in the life of the musician, obviously we're going to pay very close attention here. All right, let's just read along this speech, this work of nonfiction, and enjoy it.
Hold fast your dreams and trust your mistakes, by Billy Joel. Commencement speech at Fairfield University, Fairfield, Connecticut, May 19th, 1991. When I was first asked to speak to the graduating class of Fairfield University, my initial reaction was not too dissimilar to a certain philosophy professor who is a member of the faculty here. I had to ask myself, what makes me qualified to do this? What relevance do I have to the future lives of these young people? After all, I did not even go to college, and I did write a song called Only the Good Die Young, so why me? After meeting with a group of Fairfield students, I realized what I might be able to share with you from my perspective. I have lived what many would consider to be an unorthodox life, but it has always been an interesting one. It is true that I did not graduate from high school, but like you, I did spend years majoring in my own area of study. I am a graduate of the University of Rock and Roll, class of 1970. My diploma was a check. A week's worth of wages earned from playing long nights in smoky, crowded clubs in the New York area. Through the years, I have been given platinum albums, Grammys, keys to cities, and many other awards which are considered prestigious in my profession. But the greatest award I have ever received was that check. my diploma, made out to Billy Joel in 1970. This particular check was enough to cover my rent and my expenses. It was also enough to convince me that I no longer needed to work in a factory or be a short-order cook or pump gas or paint houses or do any of the other day jobs I had done in order to make ends meet. That check meant that I was now able to make a living solely by doing the thing that I loved most,
762.
making music. It meant that I had become self-reliant as a musician. I will never forget that day. I consider it to be one of the most important days in my life. I also remember the 21-year-old Billy Joel, and I often wonder what it would be like if we could somehow meet each other. Here I am, 42, exactly twice his age. What would I think of him? Would I find him to be naive, arrogant, simplistic, crude, noble, hopelessly idealistic? Perhaps all of these things. But more important, what would he think of me? Have I fulfilled his dream? Have I created the kind of music he would have wanted to have written? Have I compromised any of his ideals? Have I broken any of the promises I made to him? Have I lost the desire to be the best he could be? Would he be disappointed in me? Would he even like me? That 21-year-old has been the biggest pain in the neck I have had to endure in my life. Yet he has had more influence on the work I have done than anyone else for the last 21 years. He has been my greatest teacher, my deepest conscience, my toughest editor, and my harshest critic. He has significantly shaped my life. I can say to you today that what you are at this moment in your lives, you will always be in your hearts. When I met with your fellow students, they asked me, what is the most powerful lesson I have learned? After 11 years of classical training, I learned to play the piano, but I realized that I was not destined to be another Van Cliburn. I learned to write songs, although what I really wanted to write were symphonies, like Beethoven. I have learned to perform, but somehow I knew I would never be able to move like Michael Jackson or sing like Ray Charles. Out of respect for things that I was never destined to do, I have learned that my strengths are a result of my weaknesses, and my success is due to my failures, and my style is directly related to my limitations. You see, the only original things I have ever done have been accidents, mistakes, flubs, foul-ups, and their attendant solutions. I have an inherent talent for stumbling onto something. I am an expert at making bad choices and illogical decisions. I have discovered that after all those years of musical instruction, after all that practice to be perfect, after all that hard work trying to compose the right notes, I am gifted with the knack of hitting exactly the wrong notes at precisely the right time.
763.
This is the secret of originality. Think about it. You may have learned all there is to know about reproducing the art of someone else, but only you can commit a colossal blunder in your own exquisite style. This is what makes you unique. But then you are faced with solving the problem. This is what makes you inventive. Commit enough blunders, and you become an artist. Solve all the problems you have created, and they will call you a genius. I have learned that no matter how successful or proficient or accomplished I might think I am always going to make mistakes. I will always have to face some difficulties. I am always going to have to deal with the possibility of failure, and I will always be able to utilize these things in my work. So I am no longer afraid of becoming lost, because the journey back always reveals to me something new about my life and about my own humanity. And that is, ultimately, good for the artist.
Let's begin by going to the end of this nonfiction piece. And I just want to show you what we have often said about the notion that we are the stories we tell, we are the stories we retell, the stories we accept, the stories we reject. Did you see in the very last sentences of this speech? I'm on page 763. So I am no longer afraid of becoming lost, because the journey back always reveals to me something new about my life. Jot down at level 3A, where have you ever heard an idea that a man and a woman are defined by the journey that is taken? And of course some of you are smiling because you recognize we're talking about Homer's Odyssey all over again. I told you it's one of those famous motifs. Billy Joel builds on the idea of Homer's Odyssey, that we are defined by the journey. And it isn't just the destination, it's the actual trip that somehow makes us the person we are. Why? Because we're going to commit a whole lot of mistakes. Those mistakes will define us for who we are, especially how you respond to those mistakes, right? How do you respond to the mistakes that you've made in your life? This will, of course, be central to this speech. Now, let's go back. Notice to the very beginning. Notice how he constructs this speech. It's brilliantly constructed, this brief little commencement speech, in a series of questions. Did you see it? Notice on page 761. His first question is, why me? Dude, I didn't even graduate from high school, much less college, and here you are asking me to speak at a university, graduation class? What do I know about it? Why me? And yet notice, he answers his own question by pointing out, you know, it's funny, but I guess I had my own education, and therefore my own graduation, that didn't have anything to do with a formal experience of education, and yet it was a profound experience for me because I had to overcome a whole lot of challenges. Notice the ironies then. Let's just put it in our notes at 2B. There's some serious irony with asking a high school dropout to speak at a college graduation ceremony. Am I right about this? Right? It's ironic, and yet it's profound. Why? Because he did receive some awards later in his life. But he speaks about the one that he loved the most on page 762 was the very first time he got paid for doing the thing he loved. See, think about this. You have two options in your life. To do a job that you hate, and yet you still have to do it because you have to afford to live. Or to do a job that you love. To wake up every morning and say, I get to do something I love to do today. Obviously, it makes more sense to try to be in the second group, doing some. Now, he points out, you don't always get to do that. Notice he says, I had to do a lot of crummy jobs I didn't like doing, waiting on tables, etc., etc. But I had a dream that someday I would become, there's the term on 762, self-reliant. Now, jump down to 3A really quickly. When you're a junior next year, we're going to study Ralph Waldo Emerson's famous American essay, Self-Reliance. And, of course, Emerson made this phrase very, very famous. What does self-reliant mean to you? That you can take care of yourself. You don't need anybody else to take care of you. You do it on your own. And he says, when I received that check, that paycheck, I knew then. He says it was still one of the most important moments in his life. The second movement, he asks the second question. What would my 21-year-old self think about my 42-year-old self? If I could go back and visit. We've seen this already in earlier readings, haven't we? That question of, what would my younger self have to say to me? What would my younger self have to look at me? Would my younger self appreciate what it is that I've become? The questions, notice, on page 762. Here I am at 40. Notice, would I find my 21-year-old self, would I find my 42-year-old self hopelessly idealistic? Perhaps all of these things. What would he think of me? Have I fulfilled his dream, the 21-year-old dream? Have I created the kind of music he would have wanted to have written? Have I compromised any of his ideals? Have I broken any of the promises I made to him? Have I lost the desire to be the best he could be? It is a fascinating question to ask. If you could go back to your 6th grade self, the day you started middle school as a sophomore, and have a conversation, what would that 6th grader look at you as? Would that 6th grader be proud and say, whoa, you did it, high five? Would that 6th grader look at you as kind of shame? How would you feel about that one? Notice we have some repetition of some ideas here. He talks about that 21-year-old self on page 762. Notice, he has been my greatest teacher, my deepest conscience, my toughest editor, my harshest critic. That is to say, the key line, that what you are at this moment in your lives, you will always be in your hearts. That is a compelling idea. Notice he says that he's learned a tremendous amount by virtue of the final questions, and that is, how do I use failure? Right? The secret of originality, top of 763, is to somehow figure out how to use your failures, the things you screwed up on, right? This is what makes you unique, he says. And when you are unique, he says, it makes you inventive. That connection between being unique and inventive is obviously a powerful one as well. He says it finally, I, and by definition you, will always make mistakes, always have to face difficulties, always have to deal with the possibility of failure, always be able to utilize all of these things in making you who you are and the work that you do, so that the journey back always reveals to me something new about my life and about my own humanity. And that is ultimately good for the artist, to consider where you came from and to understand where you're going and to recognize the trajectory of your journey. All right, let's jump really quickly to 2a. What do you want to qualify as the major theme of this text? Notice in your hymnal on page 762 that the theme, do you see it there in the left-hand margin on the right, on the left, or down at the bottom? The theme, what does the use of words like flubs and foul-ups show about Joel's attitude towards mistakes? This theme is obvious. You have to make mistakes to go forward. Let's write that one down. That's the key, isn't it, at 2a? You have to make mistakes. You have to be willing to take risks and make mistakes if you're going to be successful in your life. I have students that don't want to ever try out for anything, go for something more difficult, because they're worried that they might screw up. No. You will screw up. That's the whole point. Learning to value mistakes is the only way to become unique. And in the process, of course, inventive as an artist and as a human. At 2b, what is for you the technique that's most compelling? Many will point out the use of the question and the rhetorical question here. What would the 21-year-old say to me, the 42-year-old, exactly double in age? What would me as a 42-year-old have to say back to my 21-year-old self? That's a compelling question. Finally, at 3a, what's the texts for you that come to mind here? We mention, of course, always in a text like this, Psalm of Life, Longfellow's classic poem, in this world's broad field of battle, in the bivouac of life, be not like dumb-driven cattle, be a hero in the strife. You got to learn how to survive, go through struggles, and find your way out on the other side. Let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. What is for you? We mentioned the Odyssey, obviously, but what is for you the text that teaches you? You got to keep going. You cannot quit. You have to find a way to survive and get through. Finally, at 3b, we have said often in 303 that the most important question you can ever ask yourself is not, why did this happen to me? But rather, why did this happen for me? Especially when bad things happen. What has been, watch this 3b question. A text like this challenges you to think about this. What has been your biggest screw up, your biggest flub up, your biggest mistake in your life? Write it down. What has been that for you? Without question, you would say, oh man, I don't even have to think about that. That definitely was my biggest screw up. Now question 2. How have you used that in some way? How have you used that to make yourself more unique, to make yourself more inventive? In what ways are you still learning how to play this game? Because guess what? in your sophomore year, you will at times be sophomoric. That is to say, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to screw up. Your ability to admit that mistake, to be honest and to be humble, and to recognize I can learn from that experience, and in the process of learning then, I become unique and I become inventive in some way. That is to say, I find a way for my journey to matter, which is always the goal. Thank you, Billy Joel.